Good day, everyone. Hope that you guys are having a good start to your Monday. Today is March 2nd. If you look at our semester calendar, which I'm going to share for you guys in just a second, this puts us in a place where, and I am recording, just have to make sure of that, semester calendar, that's what I'm trying to share. Um, okay, great. So we are on day 12 of 29, or meeting number 12 of 29. There is a quiz that is up. The discussion will be posted after class. We've got biochemistry basics with a focus on proteins today. I will post the Zoom meeting later on today. But what I wanted to mention was to kind of put this in context as to where we are in the semester and what we'll be doing. We've got this plus three more meetings before our spring break. So we'll have no class that week. So 16th and 18th, no class, no assignments or anything like that. Exam number two won't be until April 1st. The stuff that we're doing now leading up to exam number two is all going to be on there. Um, and I have some travel that I need to do for a funeral and family stuff. So I think that May 30th or March 30th, not May 30th. May 30th, you guys will be gone. But March 30th is going to be asynchronous. I'm like 90% sure on that. We just have to kind of ensure, and we'll do that in a few days, or my family and I will do that in a few days. But that's going to be a pre-recorded lecture. I'm going to try to have office hours either that same day or later on that Tuesday. Um, but we've got, so long story short, there's a good bit of material between, um, well, our last exam and this exam. But I will try to get the review materials out as soon as possible. And so that you guys have something that you can work with. Now, with that said, I'm going to go into biochem proteins, this slide deck. We don't have any, did I share my screen? Yeah, I did. Good. We don't have any poll questions today. So if you are here, you will be getting credit for those poll participation questions. The discussion will be posted a little bit later today. It's that one. But let's go ahead and get cracking. So what we've been talking about up until now has all been about amino acid structures. And we started talking about amino acids because we talked about polymers, and then we got into biological polymers. Now, we are going to be introducing major biological macromolecules. I'm going to be talking about proteins today, and then we'll talk about sugars, proteins, and lipids. So I'm going to talk about, or we're going to get into sugars and lipids because you probably have some familiarity. And oh, please go ahead. I had someone in my last class say that they could not read what I wrote on the screen with my stylus. Can you? And they said it wasn't large enough. Can anyone? I'm not sure. They maybe were watching on their phone. Um, but could everyone give me a Y or an N? If yes, I can read it, or N, no, I can't. Okay, good. So we're going to be talking about lipids and sugars and proteins. Proteins today, because when we talk about proteins, we're going to classify them as those that have like a function, like a structure. They play a role in structure, or we're going to talk about proteins as enzymes. And enzymes are the proteins that help us with metabolism. They take sugars and give us energy. They take lipids and give us, lo and behold, energy. So we're going to kind of introduce them in that sequence. But I want you guys to have a good understanding of proteins and their structure and their levels of organization. So could everyone give me a one in the chat if they remember seeing this at the end of our last slide deck or last Wednesday's meeting? And a Q in the chat if I've never seen that before in my life. And if you weren't here, didn't look at it, Please abstain from answering. Well, what this is showing, this figure right here, is showing how two amino acids react together to form what's known as a peptide bond. A peptide bond is an example of a covalent bond. Now, in 1310, we talk about covalent bonds as being, well, sharing of electrons. And that sharing of electrons is either it's even or it's uneven, and that's where we get our definitions for polar or non-polar. But we've got electrons that are shared there. And that polar or that covalent bond is the stabilizing force for the primary structure of a protein. The primary structure of a protein is simply the sequence of amino acids. Now, the sequence of amino acids is going to be N to C. And you might be thinking, what do you mean sequence of amino acids? If you remember, whenever we first introduced polymers, there were two kind of patterns that were provided. You had monomer A, monomer B, monomer A, monomer B, and so on. Could everyone give me a one in the chat if, okay, that's a little bit familiar. And you guys had a discussion that related to polymers. Okay. Now, this model right here for a polymer suggests that you have two different monomers. Could anyone add to the chat approximately how many proteinogenic amino acids do we have? How many different AAs? There are two major groups. There's the polar amino acids and the non-polar amino acids. How many different amino acids? 20. So rather than it being an A-B pattern, it might be, well, and remember those amino acids have single letter codes. So when we talk about the primary structure of a protein, that might be A, D, G, M, E, G, A, D, and so on. So that's where that's a major difference between a biological polymer like a protein and a kind of synthetic polymer or an organic polymer like what you would use for making, I don't know, like styrofoam or something like that. Now, in this case, this A and this B are really just placeholders. Whereas these right here, well, we have a single letter code, or we have single letter codes for amino acids. So I want you to know this slide well and know the level of protein structure. Your primary structure is your amino acid sequence from the N termini to the C termini. So you're reading it from the N end of an amino acid to the C end. So that is stabilized by covalent bonds or a covalent bond. The specific covalent bond is a peptide bond. Now, our secondary structure, these are known as our local structures, and we'll get into these in a moment, but they are alpha helix and beta sheets. These are stabilized by backbone hydrogen bonding. Your tertiary structure is going to be composed of your R group interactions. Those R groups are what make all the different amino acids different from one another and how they're classified, your polar and your non-polar. The bonds that stabilize these, or the types of interactions or forces that stabilize these, are disulfide bonds and all intermolecular forces. Now, these intermolecular forces are what are known as your kind of weak forces. Does anyone remember ever hearing about hydrogen bonding, aside from in the spot right here? Give me a Y or an N if you've ever heard of hydrogen bonding. Great. So hydrogen bonding is an example of an intermolecular force. So the tertiary structure is going to be stabilized by things like hydrogen bonding. Last but not least is your quaternary structure. your fourth highest level of protein structure. And this is all about how your subunits interact with one another. And again, this is disulfide and all intermolecular forces, but I'm going to add a little detail between different diff polymers. Okay, so let's go back to that primary structure. This is red from the N termini to the C termini. Notice this is the N termini and this is the C termini. So this is amino acid number one. This is amino acid number two. This is stabilized by a peptide bond. And typically, whenever you're shown a primary structure, you're going to see the one letter and three letter codes, but more commonly, you're going to see the one letter codes. And what that might look like is something like this, all capital letters. ARK would be the primary structure of a peptide. A represents alanine, R represents arginine, and K represents lysine. Could anyone give me a 3 in the chat if, oh, they already knew A was alanine or R was arginine and K was lysine? Give me a 3 in the chat if you're like, I got that down. So you'll need to. Primary structure is the amino acid sequence, and this is kind of a definition. This is a good definition to remember. A something is called a peptide as long as it is less than 49 amino acids. A protein is anything larger than that. So if you saw 49 amino acids, that is a peptide. 50 or more amino acids in a chain, that is a protein. All right. Now, primary structure is pretty simple in the sense that there's not a lot more to it. You got to know the definition of it, you got to know what stabilizes it, and you got to know how to read it, the directionality and what the code means. And by that I mean if you were to see a code like this, LLLLR, I would want you to say, okay, well that is a peptide. And that peptide is leucine. I'm just going to write leu, and I'm going to put 4x followed by then arginine. And it is a peptide. That's kind of our definition of this specific one. And pep bond stabilizes. All right. Now our secondary structure. So the next level. This is stabilized. I like to bring this up as much as possible. This is stabilized by, I gotta adjust the thickness of that pen there. Stabilized by backbone H bonds or hydrogen bonds. And this structure right here on the left sort of shows that, but it's a little bit, there's a lot to decipher there. Now, anytime you see a red dashed line or a dashed line for that matter, that is a hydrogen bond. So this dashed line, it's a hydrogen bond. So if you were to look at this structure, if I were to ask you, how many hydrogen bonds do you see? Well, I'm going to highlight. I'm going to adjust there we go. Here's one, here's two, three, four, five. I see 5 hydrogen bonds there in this particular structure. Every other bond that I see, so for instance, these black bonds right here, or here, those are covalent bonds, but the red dashed lines denote hydrogen bonds. Now, the secondary structure makes something that looks like this or like this. So when you kind of squint your eyes, like if you look really closely, that's when you can see the hydrogen bonds, and that's what those structures are. But then if you kind of take a step back and look at it, and you're like, what am I looking at? I see kind of organization. to it. I see a higher organized structure. Those are your secondary structures. This picture shows us our two major structures. These are often referred to as local structures. Like I said, they're stabilized by hydrogen bonds, specifically backbone hydrogen bonds. And it is the amide hydrogen and a carbonyl oxygen which will hydrogen bond. Now, there are some patterns that exist in secondary structure. And as a result of that, people have studied these patterns. And when you study a pattern, it gives you kind of power. Like, give me a one if you've ever seen the movie Groundhog Day starring Bill Murray. And give me a zero if you've never heard of that movie. Okay. If you've never heard of Groundhog Day, I think it's a really funny movie. It's like a it's a comedy, but it's almost like really dark, and it's almost like a deep philosophical movie. The premise of the movie is the guy relives Groundhog Day. He relives the 2nd of February. And I think that there is some director's notes that said that it went on for like 10,000 days. And we watch him every morning wake up and he sees a pattern. And he sees patterns every single day. He wakes up, the same song plays on his alarm clock. It's really funny. I think it's a great movie. I think it's a really uplifting and fun movie, but he sees patterns. And whenever he sees these patterns, he's like, well, I know that a Bob Dylan song is going to play on the radio when my alarm clock goes off. I know that since he's the only person reliving it, then he can see what everyone else is. I can predict that the first person who talks to me when I leave my hotel room is this person, and then the next person is this, and then this. So the point is that he recognizes patterns, which gives him the ability or the power to predict. And so when you have patterns, is it like the Truman Show? A little bit, but in the Truman Show, everyone else is an actor. In Groundhog Day, nobody's an actor. Nobody knows, or sorry, I mean, it's a movie, so everyone's an actor, but nobody knows that he's reliving the same day. Great, but yeah, like Truman Show in that it's a comedy, but it's a pretty deep movie, in my opinion. Maybe that just shows I'm not very deep. But anyway, it gives him this ability to predict. And when you recognize patterns, like what people have done with proteins and secondary structure, is that then they can predict it. And they can say, oh, well, if I see this particular amino acid sequence, then I can predict what it's going to look like. And that is super powerful because it gives you the ability to say, oh, well, here's the sequence of amino acids. I think that's going to form this structure. And when you can do this prediction, that's going to be very helpful for drug design. And whenever I say drug design, I'm not talking about substances or illegal, illicit substances. I'm talking about like medications, cancer therapies. You get this ability to see what a protein looks like, see what an enzyme looks like, and then you have this method to design a drug to combat it. Okay, so these two major secondary structures are known as an alpha helix and a beta sheet. Now I'm going to go back and forth between these two. What I want you to know about an alpha helix is that the average alpha helix is about 10 amino acids long. Now, here's a side view of it, and I'm going to draw something that I want you to kind of see with me. We've got this, can everyone see this ribbon? How I just shaded over it with purple or with kind of a pink. And here I'm going to do it again, and then here I'm going to do it again. What I'm trying to show you there is that there's depth to this. So this is a 3D, and it kind of has like a cylinder shape. So this is organized as a helix. And I'm guessing that y'all have heard of a helix before. Maybe you've heard of a DNA double helix. This is a biological molecule, but this is not a double helix. This is a single helix. So what that means, it's a single strand that makes a helix. I always liked whenever I'm describing helices to grab something off my desktop and kind of show you what that looks like. And at the moment, what I have, what's the implement that you got, Joel? HDMI cable is what it is. Today it's the HDMI cable. Last time I did this, it was a USB cable. Um, so what it looks like is, imagine this HDMI end is one end of this alpha helix of this peptide, and basically it wraps around and it makes like a coil. Now you guys, I don't want to cut this for the purposes of it costs money, but for dramatic flair, I kind of want to cut it and for the visualization of it. But here's what it looks like. It just kind of coils around itself. And there you go. Here's side view. Here's the top view down. Could everyone give me a 5 if, yeah, I understand what a helix looks like. And that was a top-notch HDMI alpha helix that you showed us. Good. I'm glad that you guys started to respond with the 5, and then I added the compliment for myself. So thank you guys very much for the compliment. That's very thoughtful of you. Okay. So there we go. That's an alpha helix. Our other secondary structure is a beta sheet. Now, a beta sheet looks a little bit different. And there's a couple models of beta sheets that are shown. Now, what's important for you guys to remember is, what are these two things? The alpha helix and the beta sheet, what are they stabilized by? They are stabilized by backbone H bonding. And I'm going to circle something, and then I'd like somebody to, and resolution might not be good enough for this. Let's see what I can do. Minimize that. Oh, I can go full screen mode on this. That's better. That's a little better. I don't know if that changed your view. Helped me a little bit, but I circled something. Could anyone tell me what that is? The thing that I circled? Add it to the chat if you can. Perfect. It's a hydrogen bond. That's a hydrogen bond between a carbonyl oxygen and an amide hydrogen. Oh, dang it. This is where my full screen kind of falls apart. No, I don't want to close this. Oh boy. Oh boy. Is it F11, I think? No, function F11. Let's see what can you do, Joel? Oh, okay, we're good there. Good. Okay, didn't close it. So backbone hydrogen bonding is what stabilizes the alpha helix and the beta sheet. Now, what I want you guys to know is all of these right here. Let's start with this one. I'm going to do some erasing. Sorry. Let's start with this one right here. This model is a pretty simple model. Here's our N termini and here's our C termini. And here's parts of the peptide. If you can, I'm going to change colors. I'm going to go with red. So that will stand out a little bit more. And actually, I'm going to zoom in. Good. That zooms in for you guys as well. I'm going to do some erasing. And then I'm going to start with my red pen at the N termini right here. And I'm basically just following this peptide. It's almost like I'm reading the primary structure, going amino acid after amino acid. And as you can see, it's kind of like a very curvy road. And that is a kind of simple, but not too simple organization for a beta sheet. If we look down at example B, we've got our N termini right here, and we go loop, 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 loop. Okay. Now, if we look out at C, oh boy, we've got this simple sort of pattern, and then, it swings back. And then this pattern, oh boy, there's a lot going on there. Now, what these look like when you visualize this or when you look at this something in 3D, they're actually going to look like A is going to look like D. B is going to look like E. C is going to look like F. because we're looking at local structures, but they are going to contort themselves and they're not going to be on this flat plane. They're going to contort themselves to look like this. Now, what I want you guys to know about this is first and foremost, backbone hydrogen bonding stabilizes the beta sheet. The organization of your beta sheets, though, is either going to be anti-parallel or parallel. It's still going to be stabilized by hydrogen bonding. Now, between the two of these, I'm going to label it A and B. I want you guys to tell me which one of these do you think is going to be stronger? And I'm going to give you a little bit of a focus. Look at these hydrogen bonds. Do you think A is going to be stronger or B is going to be stronger? Stronger or more stable? And try to take a pause and be like, what could make this thing stronger? What could make a hydrogen bond stronger? And, you know, yeah, I'll pause right there. So when you look at these two different models, I got a direct message of A, and you are absolutely correct. I'm not sure what your thought process was, but great. Let me, I got another private message. Now, let me tell you, and I hope that this was your part of your thought process. One of the things that I notice about A is that the two parts of the hydrogen bond, the NH and the O, it's a straight line. Whenever I look at B, I've got my two parts, and yeah, it's a straight line, but it's at an angle. So this and this, they're directly across from one another. Whereas this guy and this guy, they're like this. They're kind of at an angle. What that means is that your anti-parallel beta sheet is stronger. Sometimes you'll see this listed or you'll see it written as the alpha symbol parallel. But what I want you to take away from this is that anti-parallel is stronger due to H bond pairs, due to H bond pairs being directly across from one another. You got a private message. I was thinking this, but why is it actually strong? Oh, that's great. So the way that I always kind of think about it is I think about bonds as being, I'll go with a covalent bond. Electrons are shared. And if they're equally shared, perfect. What that means is that we've got basically two forces that are equally attracted to it. And I always think about that as like let's go with a really bulky chain. Hydrogen bond is weaker than a covalent bond. So IMFs, intermolecular forces, which hydrogen bonds are an example of those. I think about it. Hydrogen bond is like, I'll drop it down in terms of its strength. A hydrogen bond, the two things that are trying to share, like, let me go ahead and show what this looks like. A carbonyl oxygen, because that's what we're looking at right here. What does that look like? That looks like this. Here's our oxygen. That oxygen has two lone pairs of electrons. So I'm not really interested in the carbon, but I am interested in this right here. Oh, that was a bad color to use. So I'm going to go with yellow. Now, one thing that I want you to know about this oxygen is this oxygen has these lone pairs, this one and this one, but that oxygen is saying, hey, these electrons are mine. They belong to me. And hydrogen over here, Hydrogen says, "Oh, I love electrons." Hydrogen is like, you know what? If there's some electrons that I can be near, I'd really like to be near those electrons. So this hydrogen is like, hey, you've got those extra electrons. Can I hang out with them? And this oxygen says, yeah, but they're mine. You can stand next to them, and you can gain any clout from that you'd like, but they are my electrons. And hydrogen's like, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, so there's my personification of it. And that is going to bring me to my point where hydrogen bonds are almost like I'll go with if that's a bulky chain of steel is the material. Um, a hydrogen bond is kind of like I don't know, let's go with a cloth ribbon. Okay, so hydrogen is kind of latching onto these oxygens with a super weak cloth ribbon, and it's like, I'm gonna hold on to them. Oxygen saying, yeah, you can do that, but not for very long. Now, what that means is that if you if I put a cloth ribbon between my two hands, okay, and could anyone who's with me, could you give me a T in the chat if I'm with you? I'm still with you. You're jumping around on your analogies, but I'm still with you. Great. So if I have this cloth ribbon between my two hands, and I'm not pulling super hard, but I've got it between those two hands, and then it's let's say that's a foot right there. If I pull my right hand down, that was my right hand going down. What has that done? That's put a little bit of stress on this ribbon. It used to be they're directly across from each other, so it was forces going in these same directions. But now I've moved my right hand, so there's still a force going that way. There's still a force going this way, but now there's another force going down. So when my hands are pulling this cloth ribbon directly apart, opposite and equal forces. When I go down here, now it's like, well, there's the right left forces, but then there's also a down force that's adding. So this is effectively adding, sorry, I'm going to come over here. Added, and this is a word that chemists love to use, strain on H bond due to um, additional, I'll say additional angles. Yeah, I'll say additional angles. Does that help at all? Give me a Y or an N if you followed all of that. Okay, great, great. Just got a notification. I'm sorry to be distracted by this, but I got a notification. My youngest son turned 1 year old on Saturday, and so he at daycare and birthday celebration. So there he is. That's Hank, also known as Hankster, Hankeroni. Oh, I got two pictures in the daycare. Okay, I apologize. You guys didn't. This is sorry. It's off. I'm distracted. I apologize for that. Okay, so backbone hydrogen bonds stabilize beta sheets. Backbone hydrogen bonds stabilize alpha helices. When it comes to beta sheets, you have parallel and anti-parallel beta sheets. Anti-parallel are stronger because the hydrogen bonds are directly across, or the hydrogen bond pairs are directly across, and they're equal and opposite forces. Parallel, you've got this angle, so there's added strain to it. Now, so when it comes to beta sheets and alpha helices, those are your two types of secondary structures. They are both stabilized by the same type of force. Alpha helices or alpha helixes. I say helices because when you talk about multiple helix, it is helices. Um, there are no parallel or anti-parallel hydrogen bonding when it comes to classification of that secondary structure. Now, like I said, this is your secondary level or your second level. I highlighted, or I want to highlight these structures right here, here, and here. These structures are kind of the translation or the added visualization of this right here. One parallel that I've always thought about is your secondary structure. And I don't know if anyone's ever done this, but your secondary structure is kind of like regular Nintendo or Super Nintendo Mario. Mario went from the left to the right. That's all that he did. He went from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, and then you could go back from the right to the left. But there was only two dimensions. You know, you saw Mario this way, and that was it. Now, when you got to, say, like the Switch, I'm going to jump ahead quite a bit here. Well, now when you're playing the Switch, you see Mario can turn around. He's got three dimensions to him. So your Super Nintendo or your regular Nintendo is similar to your secondary structure, which is your 2D visualization. The Switch is what that 2D model looks like in 3D. So this switch gives us our tertiary or our 3D structure and our quaternary structure. Now, these are our four levels of protein structure. We've talked about primary structure being stabilized by peptide bonds. Secondary structure, backbone, H bonds. Tertiary structure, which is R group interactions. Interacting in three dimensions. And your quaternary is also R groups, but the biggest difference here is multi-peptides or multiple polypeptides. Sorry for my handwriting there. Now, one thing that I want you to know is that these two things are basically the same, but the question is, do we have a single polypeptide, a single polymer, so one polymer, or do we have two plus polymers? And keep in mind, this is polymers of amino acids. So don't fall into the trap of saying, oh, okay, so primary structure is one dimension, secondary structure is 2D, tertiary structure is 3D, and quaternary structure is 4D. That's not the case because all that we're looking at is these two are both 3D structures. All right. Now, could you give me a 1 to 5? One, I feel pretty good about it. Five being, I'm a little bit confused about what I need to know. 1 to 5 on primary and secondary structure. The one being, I know what I need to know and I feel good about what I need to know. Five being, I don't know what I need to know and I don't know, period. A three would be something like, I think I know what I need to know, and of what I need to know, I think I'm good there. I'm getting there. I'll need to look back at it. So if you're thinking, what do I need to know? Forces. Know the forces that stabilize these. So the forces that stabilize is going to be a big part. And then um, next up would be kind of divisions. And whenever I say divisions, I mean alpha, helix, and beta sheet. And then within those, how do I divide those? Like, how do I subcategorize those? Okay, now tertiary structure is that 3D model, 3D structure. And we got two major types of 3D structures. They are your fibrous proteins and your globular proteins. A globular protein looks like this. If you were to see this in 3D, if you were to shrink yourself down to the molecular level, you'd look at it and you'd be like, that looks like a glob. Whereas this fibrous protein, well, it looks kind of like a fiber. Now, fibrous proteins, well, some examples of fibrous proteins are collagen, keratin. Those are two examples. Give me a one if you've ever heard of collagen or keratin before, and a three if I've never heard of either of those. So these two proteins, collagen and keratin, are just examples of structural proteins. People get collagen injections into different parts of their body to give structure where maybe that structure has been depleted over the years. These proteins have an organization, they have an order to them. Now, your fibrous proteins, if you wanted to kind of paint with a broad brush, I would paint with a broad brush and say fibrous proteins are structural proteins. And I would say, okay, they're structural proteins because they give structure and organization and order to something. And what I mean by that is they're going to give structure or order to something bigger than just that protein, like your lips or something like that. Okay. Now, an example of this, like I said, keratin. Keratin is a two-chain coiled coil. And these two chains, if that's where the musician got the name from, maybe, maybe not. These two chains make higher order structures. These higher order structures, so here is a two-chain coil. Here's another two-chain coil, and another, and another. These organize into things known as protofilaments, which then organize into things known as protofibrils. Now, I want you to know kind of this level of organization and how it's kind of an increasing level of organization. Then I want you to know this about collagen. If you remember, there is an amino acid known as proline. Proline is an amino acid that looks like this. I don't expect you to know what proline looks like, but what I do want you to know is that proline in its R group, which I'm circling right now, and I'm shading it in, that's just a bunch of carbons and hydrogens. When you have a bunch of carbons and hydrogens, you have a structure that is very non-polar. Okay. Now, collagen is a protein that has a bunch of prolines. So collagen is rich in protein. Now, collagen gets modified to form something known as 4-hydroxyproline. And what that looks like is this. And I'm not drawing the complete part of the molecule. I'm not drawing the molecule completely. Yeah. Sorry. No, that would be right. Looks like this. One of those hydrogens right here has been replaced by an OH. What do we know about OH? What do we know about oxygen? It loves to have these two lone pairs of electrons. So that moves this molecule from being nonpolar to being very polar. And what's significant about that is that that stabilizes. So this polar shift, I'll call it, stabilizes collagen. And collagen in your skin, whenever it's stable, well, then it remains kind of intact. Now, how does this take place? With the help of this right here, vitamin C, also known as ascorbic acid or ascorbate. Now, let's think about this. Vitamin C. Is there a group of people that you have ever heard of that are maybe deficient in vitamin C? Or a let me rephrase that, temporarily deficient in vitamin C. Maybe it's a group of people that they travel from one part of the world to another part of the world in a boat. And this is like several hundred years ago. Let me rephrase it all together. Scratch all that. Has anyone ever heard of a disease or there we go, pirates. That's what I was getting to. Has anyone ever heard of, or does anyone know the term or the disease state that somebody has when they're deficient in vitamin C? I always think of pirates just because I love to say the deficiency in vitamin C with a pirate type of tone. Scurvy. That's right, scurvy. If you don't have vitamin C, you can develop scurvy. Now, scurvy, some of the develop scurvy. If you develop scurvy, some of the things that are going to happen, your gums will recede. Recede. Another thing that can happen is if you get a cut, cuts don't heal well. I'll say well slash easily. So if you develop scurvy, then your gums are going to recede, in which case you're going to begin bleeding from your gums if they're like touched at all. If you get a cut, well, it's not going to heal very well because you don't have much collagen. So the presence of vitamin C helps collagen produce or helps a series of enzymes produce 4-hydroxyproline to stabilize collagen so that your skin is stronger, so that your gums don't recede, so that whenever you get a cut, you can heal by growing new skin cells. Okay, so this is kind of an example of a fibrous protein and what it looks like and what the significance of it is. So at this point in time, we are looking at the 3D structure of a protein. Now, what I want to do is pivot a little bit and talk about how proteins can interact in addition to this. So we talked about fibrous proteins and the roles that they play and the significance of them. Fibrous proteins basically, help your tissues heal. They can help your, depending on the presence, sorry, yeah, they can help tissues heal. They are very important for maintaining structure. Now, globular proteins by comparison. I would say that globular proteins are more common in terms of proteins that people study and a little bit more common in terms of proteins that most people are familiar with. For instance, if you've ever heard of whey protein, whey protein is a mixture of a series of globular proteins. Um, Many globular proteins, they carry out a function in that they reversibly bind something. So let's say that my hand is a protein, and let's say that my my computer mouse here is a something. My protein binds and releases, reversible binding. Now, this computer mouse is going to be known commonly as a ligand. So the protein would be my hand, and the ligand would be my comp mouse. Now, ligands can be a variety of different molecules. They themselves, and I'm talking about this not in a metaphorical sense, but instead specifically, they can be proteins, they can be small organic compounds, or they can be inorganic compounds. Now, what that means is they could be other proteins. They could be other polymers of amino acids. They can be small organic molecules like, well, CH3COOH, so acetic acid. Or they can be inorganic compounds like magnesium ions, MgCl2. That'll be an inorganic compound. Now, what's important to understand about this type of protein ligand binding, is that it's not catalytic. What that means is that the ligand is not altered. This often, when the protein binds to the ligand, causes a protein conformational change. Conformational change is a nice way of saying protein shape change. And essentially what that means here is that the protein changes, the protein changes, the ligand doesn't. Whenever you see ligand is not altered, I want to go ahead and add some detail there. No bonds are made or broken. Ligand binding can be considered regulatory. What that means is that when a protein binds to a ligand, that protein might stop. This might be like a signal of sorts. And now to kind of piggyback off of that, whenever I say a small organic compound is what the ligand might be a hormone. A hormone like insulin or glucagon. Okay, now to illustrate this example of protein ligand binding, I want to bring something that's very relevant to all of y'all. Well, you got lungs and you got muscle tissue. In your lungs, every time you do this, you get a lot of O2 in there. Your muscles need that O2 because what they want to do is they want to take that oxygen, that O2, and break down things like sugars and fats. They want to break those down so that, or with the help of O2, so that they can make a bunch of energy. So that your heart can pump blood throughout your body, your fingers can move back and forth, I can open and close my eyes. I want to do all of that. Now, there has to be a means to transport oxygen from the lungs to the muscles. And there is. And these two proteins here, myoglobin and hemoglobin, assist in that. Could you give me a 3 in the chat if you've ever heard of either one of these, myoglobin or hemoglobin? Awesome. So these two proteins are shown down below here. This is myoglobin on the left. And then hemoglobin on the right. You might see these written shorthand form as MB and HB. Myoglobin MB and hemoglobin HB. Myoglobin on the left here, hemoglobin on the right. Myoglobin functions as an oxygen storage and transport protein in the muscles. So what that means is that myoglobin pretty much stays close to home. Stays home. Hemoglobin, by comparison, functions in identical capacity in the blood vessels. It's the world traveler. It goes from your lungs to all your tissues and it picks up oxygen. It's kind of the importer exporter. It brings the oxygen from your lungs, it imports it from there, and then deposits it, disperses it throughout your muscles. Myoglobin and hemoglobin, if you look at these two, and what I want you to do is I want you to look, let's take a gander at our hemoglobin structure here. The first thing that I want you to do is look at A. A on this right here. This is B or beta 2. Look at A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Then let's look at myoglobin. Again, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. You see the same letters. Now, if you're to like take a snapshot of beta 2 and then look at myoglobin and kind of rotate myoglobin. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to grab this and duplicate it, and then I'm going to edit it, crop it down. And what I'm going to do with it is rotate it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the image so that it is picture effects. No, that's not what I want. Picture layout. I think that, no, that's not what I want. Format picture, that's what I'm looking for. What I want to do with this is I want to adjust the picture transparency. I'm going to put it at about 35% or so. Can you see how, and maybe, can you see how they kind of overlay one another? They're very similar. Can you give me a Y if you see that, or the Z if no, I don't see that. And I can adjust the transparency a little bit. Like if I go, okay, there we go, and then I bring it back to my hemoglobin, myoglobin, hemoglobin, myoglobin. Okay, now I'm going to delete the myoglobin because what I was trying to illustrate there is that myoglobin and hemoglobin are built on a common structural motif. This is known as the globin fold. This is a really $5 word way of saying that they are structures are similar. So the 3D structure of these two proteins are similar to one another. Now, the polypeptide chains fold around a prosthetic group. That would be this thing right here. And it's kind of, now I got to go to a different color on that one. Let's go with the pink. That thing that I've highlighted right there, then I highlighted here, here, and here. That's known as a prosthetic group. A prosthetic group, I always think about that just like how I think about a prosthesis. If a person has a prosthetic hand or arm, that helps them do something that if they did not have that, they would struggle to do. In this case, this prosthetic group for hemoglobin and myoglobin helps them bind O2, helps them bind to oxygen. So the difference between myoglobin and hemoglobin is that myoglobin exists as a monomer. What that means is that it's one polypeptide. And it is happy as one polypeptide. Whereas hemoglobin, could anyone tell me in the chat, how many polypeptides does it look like hemoglobin consists of? And there are two colors, but I want to draw your attention to this right here. 4. Hemoglobin is made up of 4 unique polypeptides. Great answer, Maddie. 4 PPs, 4 polypeptides. Now, hemoglobin, myoglobin. Myoglobin is 1 polypeptide, 1 heme molecule. Hemoglobin, 1, 2, 3, 4 hemoglobin or heme molecules. So myoglobin binds O2. Hemoglobin binds 4O2. To take this other point, a monomer versus 4 polypeptides, well, the myoglobin has a tertiary structure. Myoglobin does not have a quaternary structure, whereas hemoglobin has a quaternary structure because it's made up of multiple polypeptides. Okay, could anyone add to that? Okay, so this is kind of all of the important, this is the important material about hemoglobin and myoglobin. What makes them similar? What makes them different? Myoglobin is your example of a tertiary structured protein. Hemoglobin is a quaternary structured protein because it has 4 polypeptides. They function differently because hemoglobin picks up 4O2 molecules and deposits those. Myoglobin only holds on to one. Now, myoglobin, if we look at that structure a little bit more, and I'm looking at myoglobin structure alone because there's less noise to it. But what I want you to see here is this is your heme ring. In the center of that heme ring is an iron ion, Fe2+. That iron is what enables myoglobin to bind O2. So what I was talking about with the function, this prosthetic group, I'll add in parentheses, prosthetic group, it provides myoglobin with this added functionality. If myoglobin did not have the prosthetic group, and if hemoglobin did not have that prosthetic group, I'll add this, if there was no heme, O2 binding would be, I'm going to say, I don't want to say impossible, would be less likely, would be more, I'll just say more difficult. Because the heme ring holds on to the iron ion, and that iron ion attracts and binds O2. Okay. Now, these are your globular proteins. So this is an example of two globular proteins. Now I want to give you one last kind of big class of globular proteins. And this term right here, enzymes. Could you give me a Y in the chat if you've ever heard of an enzyme, if you've ever heard that term mentioned? And if you've ever heard that term, can you think of and add to the chat where you've heard that term and maybe a phrase or something like that? I'll give you a little bit because the phrase that I can think of for enzymes is I've heard of digestive enzymes. Now, give me a one or a zero? One if you've ever heard of digestive enzymes or heard that term, and then a zero if no, I've never heard that before. Okay. So I like this term as kind of our branch point because if you've ever heard of the term digestive enzymes, for instance, if you go to HEB and you're looking through the dietary supplements aisle and the Whole Foods aisle, you'll find maybe a bottle like this or something that says digestive enzymes. And I think that's a good starting point because that gives us an idea of what an enzyme is. An enzyme is a biological molecule. I'll say molecule slash substance. And what it does is it helps breaks down other substances. Now, one thing that I want to add to this is that enzymes, typically when people talk about enzymes, they are talking about proteins. I want to add a little bit of nuance or detail to that. And that nuance or detail is not all enzymes are proteins, and not all proteins are enzymes. So this point right here is an important one, but I do want you to think about enzymes. I would say more times than not, when somebody's talking about an enzyme, they are talking about a protein. But I want to add this detail as like, well, it's not absolutely. Um, so please consider that. Now, here what we have is an example of an enzyme. This is our tertiary structure, our tertiary globular structure of an enzyme known as lysozyme. Now, what lysozyme does is it chops up sugars, chops up lots of stuff. And I want to introduce this term right here, substrate. Hemoglobin is not an enzyme. It's kind of a functional protein, and hemoglobin, HB, binds O2, and I'm going to say as its ligand. So when hemoglobin binds to oxygen, it just picks it up and moves it and delivers it. It's kind of like the postman or the post person. It binds O2, takes it to its destination, and releases it. It doesn't open your mail. It just picks up your mail from the you know post office. I was trying to think of something more general. Picks up your Amazon package from the shipping facility and delivers it to your home. It doesn't open it, and if it does, it gets fired, probably, or it gets away with it for a while. An enzyme is different. An enzyme binds something. Lysozyme binds a sugar. Lysozyme binds a sugar and cuts it in two. Breaks it into two separate sugars. Okay. So that's our big distinguishment and our separating factor from between an enzyme and a protein. Hemoglobin is not an enzyme. It is a functional protein that binds to oxygen, moves it, releases it. Lysozyme binds to a sugar, cuts it in two, and releases the two pieces. Now, the same thing, these two, hemoglobin and lysozyme, are both proteins. So, what does that mean they are made up of? Amino acids. Both hemoglobin and lysozyme have a primary structure, a secondary structure, and a tertiary structure. Hemoglobin goes a step further and has that quaternary structure because it's made up of multiple polypeptides. There is an active site, and think about that as the part that actually does the work. So the amino acids that do the chemistry. And the substrate binding site as the place where the substrate, and I'm going to put in parentheses here, substrate or sugar binds. Now, I do want you guys to be familiar with some patterns here. So when it comes to enzymes and substrates, there are a couple of important patterns to recognize. For example, some enzymes have a single substrate. Some enzymes have multiple substrates. If an enzyme has a single substrate, it might produce a single product. If an enzyme has a single substrate, like what I showed with lysozyme, it might have two products. It might have multiple products. It might take a molecule, let's say a molecule like that, and it might break it here, here, and here. In which case it's got this, 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 and this. And these are just kind of symbolic representations. So we can have a single substrate that gets broken up into multiple pieces, or we can have a single substrate that produces a single product. Now, there are other models where you have a single substrate that might produce a single product, or sorry, multiple substrates that produce a single product. So that would be something like, um, let's say, molecule A plus B produces AB or C, whatever you want to call it. I'm just going with symbols here. And then multiple substrates might have multiple products. Reactants A plus B produce products C plus D. Now, these ordered, random, and ping pong, I don't want you to stress about those or worry about those. But we have covered a lot of material in terms of what proteins do. This is our foundation for what we're going to do later on when we talk about drugs, we talk about therapies, and we'll get more into all of this. But this is a good foundation. I want you to think back and look back at this and think about the different levels of protein structure. What are they? What are the stabilizing forces? I want you to organize all of this information. Then I want you to know the difference between tertiary structure and globular, or sorry, fibrous and globular. And what are examples of fibrous proteins? What are examples of globular proteins? Like I said, most often, what we will talk about moving forward is, well, we're going to be talking about globular proteins. Hemoglobin, myoglobin, and lysozyme are all examples of globular proteins. Fibrous proteins would be something like keratin or collagen. Globular proteins typically carry out some sort of unique function, like they are globular proteins that are not enzymes will carry out a function by like picking something up and moving it to a different location. Whereas an enzyme is going to pick that something up and then change it. And that change might be as simple as, hey, I've got this little old earbud holder, and the reaction is to open it. This is one substrate, one product. Okay. That's what I've got for today. Thank you guys very much for coming.